Hey everyone. Tonight's story takes us back to a London buried under frost and fog, where even the gas lamps struggled to shine through the murky December air. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, take a moment first. Make sure your blanket is tucked just right. Your pillow feels soft beneath your head, and your mind can wander safely into another time. And as you drift, remember to leave a little note in the comments saying where you're listening from. I always love reading them. Someone last week was listening from Iceland, where the nights last forever. Kind of fitting, because this story is about light in the darkest of places. London, 1853. Christmas Eve. The city was a maze of smoke and stone, its streets slick with sleet, its alleys echoing with the clatter of carriage wheels and the muffled cries of hawkers selling roasted chestnuts to anyone who still had a penny to spare. But far from the glittering shop windows and the laughter spilling from taverns, there stood a tall grey building that looked more like a fortress than a home, the workhouse of St. Bart San. Inside its walls, the season of goodwill meant something entirely different. The first thing Martha felt that morning was the cold. It crept under her thin blanket and slipped through the seams of her nightgown, settling deep into her bones like a secret that never left. When she opened her eyes, there was no glow of a hearth, only the dim grey light of dawn pressing weakly through the frosted window panes. Around her, the dormitory was a row of narrow iron beds, each one holding a child curled against the cold, breathing little puffs of mist into the frigid air. Up, all of you, up. Mrs. Grimwig Sips' voice cracked through the silence like a whip. She was the matron, sharp as vinegar and twice as sour, and even on Christmas Eve her tone promised no mercy. Floors to scrub, laundry to wash. Christmas doesn't sit clean itself. Martha sat up quickly, her breath trembling in the icy air. She was 10 years old, though small enough to pass for 7. Her growth stunted by years of poor food and endless labor. Still, something stubborn had survived in her, the smallest ember of defiance that no amount of soap, scolding, or cold water could quite extinguish. From the next bed, a small voice whispered, "Is it really Christmas tomorrow?" It was Betsy, only 6, new to the workhouse, her curls cut short and her eyes wide with that mix of hope and fear the newly orphaned often carried. Martha turned to her and smiled faintly, rubbing warmth into her own numb fingers. "Yes, Bets. Christmas tomorrow," she whispered. "And you know what that means, don't it you?" Betsy Sips's eyes widened. "Pudding?" Martha leaned closer, her voice low and conspiratorial, "and maybe an orange." The word hung between them like something sacred. Orange, the color of sunrise, the scent of summer, the taste of joy itself. Once a year, when the benefactors came, each child received one. For most, it was the only sweet thing they'd taste all year. What sept's it like? Betsy breathed. "It's..." Martha paused, searching for words big enough. "It's like tasting sunlight, sweet and sharp and warm all at once. My mum used to get us one every Christmas before..." She stopped. Before the fever. Before everything. The matron's set shadow loomed suddenly between the rows of beds. "Enough chatter. Downstairs in 5 minutes, or there said'll be no breakfast." The girls scrambled out of bed, the wooden floor biting at their bare feet like ice. They pulled on their coarse grey dresses and stiff white aprons, fingers clumsy from the cold. Martha helped Betsy with her buttons, both of them puffing into their hands to keep their fingers moving. "They shall light a bigger fire tonight," Martha whispered as she smoothed Betsy Sip's apron. "For Christmas Eve. You shall see." "Do you think Father Christmas will come here?" Betsy asked hopefully. Martha hesitated, then smiled softly. "Of course he will, but he sits very busy, so he lets the benefactors bring the gifts instead." A bell clanged from below. "Come on," Martha said, taking Betsy Sip's hand. "It's Sip's Christmas Eve porridge, that's Sip's special." They hurried into the dining hall, a vast cold room with bare walls and long wooden tables stretching from one end to the other. 100 children sat on benches, eating thin porridge in silence, the air thick with the scrape of spoons and the occasional cough. Talking during meals was forbidden. But today, through a doorway to the kitchen, Martha saw something unusual. Large copper pots bubbling on the stoves, and the faint, sweet smell of something richer than usual. She nudged Betsy and nodded toward it. They sip cooking for tomorrow. Plum pudding, I bet. The thought alone was enough to make Betsy's face light up. Then the hall fell silent again. As the master entered, a tall, thin man with hollow cheeks and a black coat that swallowed him whole. Mr. Penge, his voice echoed against the stone walls. "Children," he announced, today being Christmas Eve, "your schedule will be adjusted." A ripple of excitement moved through the room. Adjusted meant different. Different meant maybe, just maybe better. Work will continue until 4 o'clock, he went on. Then you will wash, attend chapel, and receive your evening meal. Remember, your conduct today determines the generosity of tomorrow. Martha's heart gave a small leap. Generosity was his word for oranges. After breakfast, the girls were assigned to clean the main corridors. The lye soap cracked their hands raw. The cold water stung like needles. And yet Martha worked faster, her mind full of tomorrow's promise. "They say a whole crate sip's coming," whispered Nancy, the oldest girl, her red hands scrubbing beside Martha Sips, from Covent Garden, a crate of oranges. Martha's shoulders ached. Her knees burned from the hard floor. But the thought of it, a bright fruit glowing in grey hands, made her smile. "Then tomorrow will be beautiful," she said softly, and kept on scrubbing. By late afternoon, the light over London had faded into a dull silver haze. Snow began to fall again, soft and steady, turning the city into a quiet painting. Inside the workhouse, the girls finished their scrubbing, their hands red and raw, the scent of soap clinging to their skin. The clang of the chapel bell echoed through the corridors, summoning them to wash and change. For the first time all day, the air buzzed with something that almost felt like excitement. Martha stood by the pump in the washroom, splashing her face with icy water that made her gasp. Around her, the other girls did the same, scrubbing their cheeks and hands until they glowed pink. Even the matron seemed slightly less sharp, her voice softened by the spirit of the day. Their Sunday uniforms were laid out, just as grey as their weekday ones, only patched a little less and smelling faintly of starch. "Hold still, Bets," Martha said, tying a neat ribbon through the smaller girl Sip's hair. Betsy Sip's curls refused to lie flat, springing out rebelliously around her face. "There, you look proper now. Do you think the benefactors will come tomorrow?" Betsy asked, eyes wide. "Of course they will," Martha said, smiling faintly. "They always do. And we still sing carols, and afterward, oranges." Betsy whispered reverently, as if the word itself could summon them. The chapel was the one room in the workhouse that looked like it remembered beauty. The walls were lined with ivy and holly gathered from the yard, and real candles flickered in iron sconces, their tiny flames dancing against the cold stone. The air smelled of beeswax and evergreen. The children filed in 2 lines, girls on one side, boys on the other, taking their places on hard wooden benches. Martha's eyes scanned the opposite row until she found Tom. Her brother looked solemn in his patched uniform, his dark hair falling over his brow. When he saw her, he gave their secret signal, a tiny lift of his hand. She answered with a quick wink. "I'm okay. Are you okay?" The chaplain began to speak, his voice deep and slow. "Tonight we remember the birth of our Saviour, born in humble circumstances, as all of you were. Let his example guide you in gratitude for the charity shown to you." Martha tried to listen. She really did, but her mind wandered. The candles glowed like stars, and their light softened even the matron's hard face. Around her, children fidgeted quietly, fighting sleep. Betsy's head began to droop against her shoulder. Martha nudged her gently, smiling. When the hymn began, "O come all ye faithful," the children sang with thin, wavering voices, but it was still beautiful in its own way. Their breath rose in little clouds of white, their small hands clasped together in prayer. After chapel, they were herded back into the dining hall, where an unexpected sight waited for them: bread and cheese. Not the usual watery soup, but real bread soft enough to tear with their fingers, and cheese that glistened yellow under the gaslight. The rule of silence was lifted, and low murmurs filled the room, tentative at first, then warmer, almost happy. "Look," Betsy whispered. "Real cheese." Martha grinned. "Merry Christmas Eve, Bets." She managed to pass half her portion to Tom when the matron wasn't looking. A secret act of kindness in a world where kindness was scarce. Her brother gave her a small nod of thanks, his eyes bright in the dim light. When supper ended, they were sent upstairs to the dormitory. Outside, the city was hushed under a growing blanket of snow. The world beyond the workhouse walls had turned pure white, but inside the room was still cold and bare. Yet something in the air felt softer tonight, a shared awareness that tomorrow would be different. Martha helped Betsy climb into bed, pulling the thin blanket over her. The little girl's nose peeked out, red from the cold. "Martha," Betsy murmured sleepily, "tell me again what it tastes like." "The orange?" "Yes." Martha smiled into the darkness. "It tastes like sunshine, Bets. Like the best day of summer when the air smells of flowers and the world feels warm and alive. You sit or see tomorrow." "Promise?" "I promise." A silence fell between them, filled only by the soft rustle of blankets and the faint whistle of wind through the windows. Snowflakes gathered on the sill, tiny ghosts of winter. Somewhere in the city, church bells began to ring, slow and solemn, carrying through the night air. Christmas was almost here. Martha closed her eyes, clutching the edge of her blanket, and tried to imagine warmth, to pretend that she could feel it seeping into her bones from some invisible fire. She pictured oranges glowing like little suns, waiting in their crate downstairs. For one night at least, that thought was enough. The morning came slowly, seeping into the dormitory as a pale grey light filtered through the frosted window panes. Before the first bell even rang, a whisper began to ripple through the rows of narrow beds soft as snow. "It sets Christmas. It sets Christmas." Martha Sip's eyes fluttered open to find Betsy already sitting up, her blanket clutched around her shoulders, her eyes wide with the kind of hope only children could still afford to feel. "Martha, it's Sip's time. Listen, the bells." And indeed, somewhere in the distance, faint and muffled by snow, the chapel bells of St. Bart's were ringing. Not for work, not for punishment, for Christmas. Martha sat up quickly, the cold biting at her nose and fingers, but for once she didn't set mind. "It sits Christmas, Bets. Today we get our oranges." The dormitory came alive with movement. Girls pulling on their grey uniforms, smoothing aprons, braiding each other's hair with frozen fingers. The matron's shout came later than usual, her voice less sharp, almost human. "Up, girls, Christmas service in 1 hour. Wash properly and no dawdling." The washroom was a chaos of giggles and splashes. The water from the pump was icy enough to sting, but the girls laughed through chattering teeth. Martha helped Betsy scrub behind her ears, both of them pink from cold and excitement. "Hold still," she said, smiling. "You'll look like a princess today." "Do you think Father Christmas came?" Betsy asked hopefully, her lips blue but smiling. "I think," Martha said softly, wringing out her towel, "that he said'll find a way to reach everyone, even here." When they entered the dining hall, the sight made Martha's heart lift. Holly and ivy hung along the walls, and on each long wooden table stood a small branch of fir tied with a red ribbon. The air smelled faintly of baking bread and candle wax. For a moment, the workhouse didn't feel like a prison. It felt almost like home. The children took their seats, the hall buzzing with quiet excitement. Mr. Penge, the workhouse master, stood at the head table wearing a red waistcoat that strained slightly across his thin frame. He raised his hands for silence. "Children," he began, "in honor of Christmas Day, a special breakfast will be served. You may speak quietly among yourselves." The hall erupted into delighted murmurs. Talking during meals, unthinkable on any other day, felt like the greatest gift of all. Servants brought trays of bread thick with butter and small pots of jam. Martha tore her slice carefully, spreading the jam thinly so it would last. Beside her, Betsy licked her fingers, her cheeks flushed. "It sits so sweet," she whispered in awe. "I never tasted anything like it." "Dunfit eat too fast," Martha warned gently. "You still want to remember this." Across the hall, Martha spotted Tom among the boys. He was grinning, a rare sight, his cap askew and his face red from excitement. He caught her eye and mimed peeling something imaginary. Martha laughed quietly. He was thinking of oranges too. After breakfast came chapel. The children walked in pairs through the corridor, their shoes squeaking faintly on the cold stone floor. The chapel glowed with candlelight and evergreen branches. The chaplain spoke of humility and hope, of the Christ child born in a stable, poor but beloved. Martha listened more closely this time. For once, his words didn't sound like sermons. They sounded like promises. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. After the service, the children were gathered back in the dining hall. The tables had been cleared, and in their place were baskets piled high with small wrapped parcels and a wooden crate at the front of the room that made every heart leap. The oranges. When the doors opened, a wave of cold air swept in, followed by the benefactors, men and women in fur-trimmed coats, their cheeks flushed from the frost, their boots polished to mirrors. Behind them came servants carrying more baskets. Mr. Pengyastit's voice boomed over the murmurs. "Children, we are honored once again by the generosity of Mr. Cornelius Blackwood of Blackwood Bank and his guests. Please give them your attention." Martha craned her neck, curious. The man at the front was tall, his beard flecked with snow, but beside him was something, or rather someone, she'd never seen before at a workhouse Christmas. A girl. She looked about Martha's age, perhaps a little younger, wrapped in a green velvet dress with white fur cuffs, her hands tucked into a muff. Her eyes were wide as she took in the hall full of grey uniforms and thin faces. For a moment, the two girls' gazes met. Martha blinked. The girl didn't look disgusted or fearful, as most visitors did. She looked curious, almost kind. The ceremony began. One by one, the children stepped forward to receive their gifts. A new pair of stockings, a woolen cap, an apple, and at the end of the line, an orange. Each child curtsied or bowed and recited the words drilled into them. "Thank you, sir. God bless you for your generosity." When Martha's name was called, Martha Watts, her heart thudded so loud she could hear it in her ears. She stepped forward, smoothed her apron, and dropped into her curtsy. "Merry Christmas, Martha," said Mr. Blackwood, handing her the orange. His voice was deep, gentle. "Thank you, sir. God bless you for your generosity." She lifted her eyes and met the gaze of the girl in green velvet again. This time the girl smiled, a small, shy, genuine smile. Martha returned to her seat, her hands trembling around the orange. It was heavier than she remembered from past years, its peel rough beneath her fingertips, its scent sharp and sweet. The entire room smelled like sunlight. Beside her, Betsy was whispering her own prayers over her orange. "I don't want to eat it yet," she said. "I want to look at it a little longer." "Me too," Martha whispered back, holding it close. Around them, dozens of children did the same, cradling their oranges as though afraid they might disappear. When the benefactors asked the children to sing, their voices rose, thin, tired, but bright. The carols echoed off the stone walls, and for a brief moment even Mrs. Grimwig's face softened. As the final notes of "God Rest Ye Merry" Gentlemen faded, the visitors began to leave. But Martha noticed the girl in green velvet linger for a moment, glancing back one last time. Their eyes met once more across the crowded room, and in that fleeting instant something passed between them, a quiet understanding neither of them could name. For one girl, Christmas meant charity and duty. For the other, it meant survival and the taste of an orange. But for both, In that single shared glance, it meant hope. The day dimmed quickly, as London winter days always did, the light draining away into a blue-grey dusk that blurred the outlines of roofs and chimneys. Snow still fell, soundless and steady, settling in soft white layers on the workhouse windowsills and along the iron railings outside. The excitement that had filled the dining hall during the benefactor's visit began to ebb, leaving behind a kind of quiet glow like embers after a fire. The children were allowed an hour of leisure, a rare mercy. Some played quiet games with scraps of string or paper. Others sat in small groups whispering about the rich visitors, their fur collars, their polished boots, their jewels that caught the candlelight like tiny suns. Martha found Tom near one of the narrow windows, the last of the weak daylight glinting on his dark hair. "Did you see the girl?" Tom asked immediately, before she could even sit. Martha nodded. "In the green dress? She looked right at you," Tom said with a grin, half teasing, half amazed. "Maybe she thought you were a princess in disguise." "More like a chimney sweep," Martha said, smiling despite herself. "She seemed different, though, not like the others." She smiled. Tom shrugged. "They all smile at Christmas. Then they forget about us until next year." "Maybe," Martha said softly, "but I don't think she will." Tom looked skeptical, but he didn't argue. He was busy turning his orange over in his hands, studying it like a rare artifact. "Do you think it sets true?" he asked. "That these come all the way from the other side of the world?" "I think so," Martha said. "From somewhere warm where the trees grow them all year round." Tom gave a low whistle. "Imagine living in a place like that." "I do," she said quietly. "Every night." The bell rang, calling them back to the dormitories. Supper that evening was simple, bread and cheese, but the bread was fresher than usual, the cheese richer, and nobody minded the cold that crept through the cracks in the windows or the thinness of their blankets that night. Every child carried with them something bright and fragrant, and theirs, a single orange that smelled of faraway sunlight. In the dormitory, the girls climbed into their narrow beds, still talking in whispers. Some hid their oranges under their pillows, others kept them in their hands, unwilling to let go. Betsy sat cross-legged on her bed, staring at hers with wide, shining eyes. "Martha," she said finally, "when will you eat yours?" "Not yet," Martha replied. "I want to make it last. I want to see what it tastes like," Betsy said, her voice trembling between excitement and disbelief. Martha hesitated. Then she reached into her apron pocket and felt the shape of the second orange, the one slipped to her secretly by the girl in green velvet. Its weight was comforting, its scent even stronger than the first. She looked around. The matron hadn't yet come to extinguish the lamp. The room was filled with quiet chatter, laughter even, soft and strange in such a place. Martha leaned closer to Betsy. "Come here," she whispered, pulling the blanket higher around them. She brought out the second orange, the contraband treasure glowing faintly in the lamplight. Betsy sipped as eyes widened. "You have too." "Sha," Martha said quickly. "No one must know. A girl from the visitors gave it to me. I think she wanted me to share it." With careful, trembling fingers, Martha began to peel it. The skin came away in slow curls, releasing a scent so bright and fresh that for a moment both girls closed their eyes. It was as if the room had filled with sunlight. "It smells like heaven," Betsy breathed. Martha laughed softly. "If heaven has fruit trees, maybe this is what they smell like." When the orange was fully peeled, she divided the segments evenly, pressing half into Betsy Sepp's hands. "Here, Merry Christmas." Betsy bit into the first piece, and a drop of juice ran down her chin. Her eyes went wide with wonder. "It's sweet," she gasped. "And it bites your tongue, but in a good way." Martha smiled and took her own bite. The taste was almost too much after months of bland porridge and bitter soap, sharp and warm and golden. It filled her mouth with a memory of summers she could barely recall. For a long while they ate in silence, reverent, careful, making the small fruit last as long as possible. Martha saved the peel, arranging it carefully on the windowsill where the cold air would dry it and keep its scent for weeks. Around the room, the other girls were already drifting to sleep, their oranges tucked safely away like treasures. "Why do you think she gave it to you?" Betsy murmured, already half dreaming. Martha stared at the window where the snow pressed white against the glass. "Maybe," she said slowly, "because she could, or because she wanted to feel what it sips like to make someone happy." "Do you think she sips happy?" Martha thought of the girl Sip's velvet dress, her perfect curls, her eyes that had looked too serious for someone who had everything. "Maybe not as much as she should be," she said softly. "Maybe she sips lonely too." Betsy's breathing deepened, her small body curling under the thin blanket. Martha lay back, the faint smell of orange still on her fingers. She placed the other orange, the official one, under her pillow for safekeeping. She'd keep it there until the day came when she truly needed to remember that there had been warmth and light and sweetness. Even here, outside, the snow fell thicker, blanketing the rooftops and muffling the world into silence. And across the city, in a grand house on Berkeley Square, Eleanor Blackwood sat by her own window, sketching by candlelight. The fire beside her crackled softly, the air fragrant with pine and cinnamon. But she wasn't thinking about the feast waiting downstairs or the piles of gifts that had already been opened. She was thinking about a girl with dark eyes and raw red hands, standing in a cold hall filled with grey uniforms. Eleanor looked down at her sketch. The face she'd drawn was solemn but strong, the gaze direct. "Martha," she whispered, as if the name itself might bridge the miles between them. Sarah, her maid, came to bring her hot chocolate. "Still awake, miss?" she asked softly. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Just drawing." Sarah peered at the paper and nodded. "Ah, one of the workhouse children." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. She was different. Sarah hesitated, then said, "Sometimes the poorest have the richest hearts, miss. I think used to write." The firelight flickered, warm and steady. Outside, the same snow fell across both worlds, the rich and the poor, softening their boundaries for a single night. As the clock chimed midnight, two girls, one in a palace of velvet and silver, one in a bed of iron and wool, lay staring out at the same sky. And somewhere between them, the city slept beneath the hush of Christmas. Outside the workhouse walls, Christmas in Victorian London was a world of contradictions, splendor and sorrow, light and shadow tangled together like the holly and ivy twined through every parlour and every church window. On the fashionable streets of the West End, the snow that fell over gas lamps and polished carriages looked almost enchanted. In the great shop windows of Oxford Street, mechanical toys twitched to life behind the glass, little tin soldiers that marched in circles, dancing dolls in silk dresses that curtsied endlessly to invisible partners, clockwork reindeer that bowed their heads as though grazing on glitter. Passers-by crowded close to see, leaving foggy breath marks on the glass before hurrying on through the cold. Vendors shouted over the rattle of wheels and hooves. Hot chestnuts, roasted apples, plum pudding for sale. The smell of smoke and spice filled the air, mixing with the tang of horse manure and the sharpness of coal dust that never truly left London's breath. From the doors of the great department stores, Gamage's, Swan and Edgar, the new Marshall and Snellgrove, came waves of warmth, the scent of wax and polished wood and new fabric. Inside, ribbons and wrapping paper were luxuries in themselves, and clerks worked by lamplight to pack parcels for delivery before the evening post. And while the upper classes filled their carriages with gifts, boxed gloves, silk handkerchiefs, imported chocolates, carved wooden toys, the poorer streets of the East End told another story. There the snow turned to grey slush within hours, trampled by boots with holes in their soles. Children with bare heads pressed their faces to the bakery windows just to watch the golden loaves being lifted from the ovens. Christmas for them wasn't about abundance. It was about survival with dignity. About one hot meal, one clean shirt, one orange that smelled of faraway sunshine. In the alleys behind the workhouse, Men huddled near the gin shops, sharing the last of their coins for a few ounces of warmth. Street singers went from door to door, their voices trembling in the wind. "God rest ye merry gentlemen," they sang, their notes wandering off-key, but still somehow beautiful. Passers-by tossed pennies, and sometimes, the lucky ones, a scrap of meat or a heel of bread. Across the river, on the frozen pond in Hyde Park, the wealthy gathered in furs to skate. The sound of laughter and steel on ice rang clear in the cold air, while coachmen waited beside steaming horses, stamping their feet for warmth. Ladies in velvet cloaks glided in slow circles, their cheeks flushed with cold, while gentlemen in tall hats raced past, calling out with mock gallantry. And yet, even among them, charity had become a kind of fashion. Every church had its Christmas fund, every factory its donation box. Newspapers published lists of donors, from dukes to shopgirls, their names neatly printed as if generosity itself were something to be displayed. Even Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had made Christmas a national event, a season of sentiment and spectacle. It was under their reign that the Christmas tree, imported from Germany, became the very heart of every respectable home. In the Blackwood household that same night, the great fir tree in the drawing room stood 8 feet tall, its branches hung with glass ornaments imported from Dresden and small wax candles that trembled in their holders. The fire burned high in the marble hearth, and on the sideboard lay a spread of food that would have fed an entire workhouse for a day: cold roast goose, mince pies, plum pudding soaked in brandy, sugar plums in crystal bowls, and a pyramid of oranges gleaming in the candlelight. Servants moved silently between rooms, clearing dishes and setting fresh coal in the grates, while the family retired to their parlour for carols. Mrs. Blackwood, her silk gown rustling like paper, played the piano softly, while Mr. Blackwood's deep baritone filled the room. Eleanor sang too, her voice clear and pure though her mind drifted elsewhere, to grey stone walls, to thin faces, to the sound of small voices singing the same carols in another part of the city. Even among the wealthy, Christmas carried an undertone of melancholy. It was a season for reflection, for looking backward as much as forward. Many had lost fathers or sons to disease or war, and their portraits hung over the mantel, wreathed in holly, as if memory itself could be decorated. In the poorer districts, the same melancholy took on a different shape. Empty chairs, silent doorways, letters never delivered because there was no address to send them to. And yet the spirit of the holiday persisted, stubborn as ivy clinging to stone. Families with nothing still found ways to mark the day. A candle in a window, a crust of bread shared between neighbours, a song hummed softly over a pot of thin stew. These too were Christmas. In some tiny rooms where the rent collector never dared go on holy days, children hung stockings made of old socks over fireplaces long gone cold, whispering hopes to the darkness. And sometimes, if the city was feeling kind, a stranger would slip a sweet or an apple into one before morning. The streets of London that night were both cruel and beautiful. Horse-drawn carriages rolling through snow, beggars singing for coppers, bells pealing from St. Paul's over a city divided by wealth yet bound by the same frost. And as midnight neared, across that vast city of contrasts, hundreds of candles flickered in windows, some behind velvet curtains, others behind cracked glass. Their flames trembled in the same draught, and their light, though faint, reached outward into the cold. Somewhere among them one burned beside a drawing of a workhouse girl, and another beside a narrow bed where that same girl dreamed of orange trees in bloom. Christmas, in all its strange mixture of sorrow and grace, had come to London. Boxing Day dawned pale and silent, the snow now crusted hard across the rooftops, the air so cold it seemed to hum. The city had fallen into a drowsy kind of peace, as if London itself were still half asleep after its grand day of celebration. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, and the distant toll of church bells drifted through the white air, slow and comforting, a reminder that even the restless heart of the empire could pause, just for a moment, For the rich, it was a day of leisure. Fires crackled in drawing rooms, their embers glowing red against marble hearths. Servants padded softly through corridors with trays of tea and buttered toast, and children played with their new toys on rugs patterned like gardens. The morning papers arrived, the Times, the Illustrated London News, carrying long columns describing the Queen's Christmas at Windsor, the charitable donations of various societies, the list of London's most generous benefactors. Eleanor's father, Cornelius Blackwood, was among them, his name printed neatly beneath a heading that read Seasonal Almsgiving. At the breakfast table, Eleanor traced the letters with one finger, remembering the faces from the day before, the rows of children, the grey uniforms, the coldness of the stone floor under her boots. She didn't touch her food, though the table was a small feast in itself. Porridge with cream, toast thick with marmalade, boiled eggs, and a plate of ham glistening with honey glaze. "Not hungry, my dear?" her mother asked, stirring sugar into her coffee. "I'm thinking about the workhouse children," Eleanor said quietly. Her mother sighed, as though the topic were a draft that needed to be shut out. "Yes, dreadful business. But at least we Seb done our part. Your father Seb's donation will go far, and you Seb seen it all for yourself now. That should satisfy your curiosity." "It didn't satisfy me," Eleanor murmured. "It only made me wonder more." Her father looked up from his newspaper, eyes kind but distracted. "Compassion is good, my dear, but don't spoil your joy. Christmas is meant to lift the heart, not burden it." But Eleanor's heart was already burdened, with faces and voices and a small act of rebellion hidden in her memory. 6 oranges and a handful of sweets. She wondered if the girl she'd given them to, the one with the solemn eyes, had eaten them yet. She wondered what her Christmas night had been like. Outside, in the slums of Smithfield, Martha was already awake. The morning light made diamonds of frost on the windows, and the air bit through the thin blankets with renewed cruelty. The workhouse, stripped of its holiday decorations, looked again like the institution it always was, clean, cold, and silent. Christmas had passed like a bright dream, leaving behind only memories and the faint, lingering smell of oranges. Betsy stirred in her bed, rubbing her eyes. "It's over, isn't it?" she whispered. Martha smiled faintly. "Not over, just finished for now." She reached beneath her pillow and drew out her remaining orange, still whole, still perfect, its skin slightly softened by her warmth through the night. She turned it in her hands, letting her fingers trace its dimples. "See? I saved mine. For later." Betsy leaned closer, her breath clouding in the cold air. "What for?" "For when I need it," Martha said. "When everything feels grey again." And though she didn't say it aloud, she thought of the girl with the green velvet dress, and how kindness could fall from the sky as unexpectedly as snow. That morning, after a breakfast of thin porridge and bread, the children were set to their usual tasks. The workhouse had no holiday for Boxing Day. Laundry still needed washing, floors still needed scrubbing, water still needed carrying. Yet there was something gentler in the air. The matron's voice was less sharp, and even Mr. Penge, who supervised the boys' workroom, spoke more softly than usual, as if some trace of Christmas lingered in him still. Outside, London was stirring back to life. The markets opened again, though slowly. Porters in heavy coats pushed carts through slush. Chimney sweeps carried their brushes over their shoulders like banners. The shopkeepers swept their steps clear of ice and reopened their doors, while carriages rolled through the grey streets, their wheels leaving wet tracks in the thawing snow. But for one more day, the mood was softened. The usual rush and bark of city life were replaced by something hushed and reflective. People nodded to strangers, shared coals from their fires with neighbours, gave pennies to street singers whose voices cracked with cold. There was still poverty, still hunger, but there was also a strange, fragile peace, as if the entire city for these few brief hours remembered its own heart. In the Blackwood home, Eleanor sat by the window in her blue dress, watching the snow melt into rivulets along the glass. On her lap lay an open book, The Arabian Nights, the gilt edges catching the light. But she wasn't reading. She was thinking. "Sarah," she said suddenly, turning to her maid, "what if I gave some of my books to the workhouse school, the ones I set have already read?" Sarah hesitated, surprised but smiling. "I think that would be a fine thing, miss. A very fine thing indeed." Eleanor looked out again at the drifting snow. "Then I will. Tomorrow. I said'll ask father to send them." And far across the city, as the church bells of St. Paul's began to toll the afternoon hour, Martha paused in her scrubbing, looking up at the same stretch of sky. For a moment the winter light broke through the clouds, golden and gentle, falling across her face. She closed her eyes and breathed it in, the faintest echo of warmth, the memory of oranges, and the feeling that somewhere someone else was thinking of her too. The days that followed slipped quietly back into the rhythm of winter, though something had shifted in both girls, small, invisible to the world, yet strong enough to bend the course of their hearts ever so slightly. For Martha, life in the workhouse returned to its usual pattern. Dawn bells, cold water, hard brushes on rough floors, the endless smell of soap and cabbage. The decorations were taken down, the candles extinguished, the chapel bare again. And yet, this January felt different. Every night before sleep, she reached under her pillow, touched the firm roundness of her orange, and let its scent lift her from the grey walls around her to a place she'd never seen but could imagine clearly. Fields of sunlight, trees heavy with golden fruit, skies that never turned to soot. Sometimes, when the matron wasn't watching, Martha told Betsy about that imagined place. She spoke softly as they scrubbed or mended, her voice low enough not to carry, "In that country, it's never cold. The people don't wear rags. They wake when they like, and their breakfast smells like flowers. The children go to school in bright clothes, and no one ever yells at them." Betsy listened with shining eyes, believing every word. It was a kind of survival, this dreaming. One evening, as the wind howled through the cracks in the window frames, Martha peeled a single segment from her orange and shared it with Betsy. The little girl closed her eyes as she tasted it, smiling in her sleep that night as if the world were warm. For Eleanor Blackwood, the weeks after Christmas passed in gentler surroundings but with the same strange restlessness stirring beneath her calm surface. Her parents resumed their social calendar, dinners, calls, concerts. But Eleanor's thoughts often wandered to the workhouse. She found herself sketching again and again the faces she'd seen there, especially Martha's. The steady eyes, the solemn expression, the faint trace of defiance that had survived even in that grey world. One afternoon, when the frost turned the garden into glass, Eleanor gathered several of her old books, Aesop's Fables, Pilgrim's Progress, the Children's Shakespeare, and carried them quietly to her father's study. Cornelius Blackwood looked up from his desk, surprised. "Father," she said, placing the small stack before him, "could these be sent to the workhouse school for the children to read?" He leaned back, studying her. "Yes, father. The children there have nothing to read. I thought perhaps these could help." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "A thoughtful idea, Eleanor. I shalt see that they such are delivered." And though the books were only a small bundle, when the parcel arrived at the workhouse a week later, tied neatly with twine and labelled for the children's library, St. Bart's Times, it was greeted with wonder. The school mistress unwrapped them carefully, and for the first time that term the children's lessons ended with stories read aloud. Martha listened, eyes wide, the words blooming inside her like firelight. On one page of Aesop's Fables, faint pencil writing curled in the corner. Martha traced the letters with her finger, smiling. She didn't know what the initials stood for, but something in her heart whispered the answer. And so the connection remained, not through letters or visits, but through thoughts and small gestures carried quietly through the city like echoes. Winter deepened, the Thames froze at its edges, and icicles hung like glass daggers from eaves. Workhouses and mansions alike burned more coal, lamps glowed longer against the early darkness, and still the world spun on in its usual divisions of wealth and want. But somewhere beneath that frozen surface, kindness began to take root, invisible but alive. By February, Martha's orange had withered and shrunk, its peel dry and curling, its scent faint but still sweet. She kept it wrapped in a scrap of linen, tucked safely in a box beneath her bed. Whenever the world felt unbearable, she held it to her nose and remembered that one day, one perfect day when she had tasted sunlight. And in Berkeley Square, Eleanor sometimes dreamed of the same thing, the scent of citrus in cold air, the sight of snow falling on grey stone, the voice of a girl singing carols in a cracked but steady tone. She could never explain why that memory made her feel both warm and sad at once, only that it mattered in a way few things did. Years would pass before either of them truly understood how a single act of kindness can outlive the day it was given. But for that winter, the winter of the orange, London seemed, if only for a moment, a gentler city. The bells of St. Paul's tolled again, deep and slow, echoing through the fog, and in homes of brick and homes of marble, candles burned low, their light trembling but unextinguished against the long dark of the season. Christmas had ended, but its echo remained, sweet, fleeting, and bright as the scent of a single orange in a cold grey world. By March, the frost began to loosen its hold on London. The snow melted into the gutters, the air smelled faintly of smoke and wet stone, and the first weak buds appeared on the trees that lined the park railings. Yet even as spring crept cautiously into the city, the memory of that Christmas lingered, like a faint warmth that refused to fade entirely. In the workhouse, the children were set to mending and sorting, the endless cycle of repairing what the world had already thrown away. Martha's fingers had grown rough and nimble, her small hands capable of sewing without looking, but sometimes when the morning light spilled through the high windows, she'd pause and close her eyes, breathing in the faintest trace of citrus still clinging to the scrap of orange peel in her pocket. Betsy had grown stronger since winter, her cheeks rounder, her cough less harsh. Every evening she asked for another story of the faraway country with orange trees, and Martha obliged, spinning whole worlds out of air. In those stories there were no workhouses, no matron's scolding voice, no hunger. There were fields of golden fruit that never rotted, rivers that glittered like glass, and skies where it never snowed unless one wished it to. Sometimes even the older girls listened in silence, their hands stilling over their mending as Martha spoke. The matron would have scolded them for idleness had she known, but even she that winter had softened in some invisible way. Perhaps kindness, once introduced, spread like heat through stone, slowly, imperceptibly, but inevitably. Across the city, in the fine houses of Mayfair, winter had left its mark in subtler ways. The talk of Christmas had faded, replaced by plans for spring picnics and visits to the seaside, but Eleanor Blackwood had not forgotten. Her books had found their way to St. T. Bart's, and she thought often of the girl who might have read them. One afternoon she and her governess walked through Hyde Park, the sky pale blue and the last of the frost glistening like silver dust along the path. Eleanor's gloved hands clutched a small notebook. She had begun to fill with sketches, not of grand houses or fashionable ladies, but of street scenes, flower sellers, crossing sweepers, children with soot-streaked faces. "You draw the poor so often, Miss Eleanor," her governess remarked gently. "Done set. They make you sad." Sometimes, Eleanor admitted, "but I think sadness can teach us to see." She smiled faintly, her eyes distant. "And sometimes," she added, "it reminds us that kindness matters most when no one sits watching." By that spring, new laws were being debated in Parliament about the treatment of the poor. Newspapers printed editorials full of moral language and statistics, but none of those numbers could capture what Martha knew, that a single act of gentleness could last longer than a season, longer even than hunger. One grey afternoon, as rain tapped softly against the workhouse windows, the schoolmistress called the children to attention. "Today," she said, "we begin a new storybook, donated by the Blackwood family." The title read The Pilgrim Sepp's Progress, but inside the front cover, written in careful looping script, was a line that made Martha Sepp's breath catch. To the children of St. Bart's, may your journeys always lead you toward light. She didn't know what had become of the girl in green velvet, if she was happy, if she ever thought again of that cold hall. But at that moment, Martha felt sure of one thing, that their paths somehow would cross again. Years later, she would remember that feeling as clearly as the scent of her orange, the hum of the chapel bells, the sound of soft carols echoing off stone. She would remember it every Christmas that followed, every time she saw a tree hung with tinsel or smelled oranges in the marketplace. For the world had changed her, yes, but not hardened her. It had simply taught her to keep her warmth hidden, like a coal under ash, waiting for the right moment to glow again. And perhaps that was the truest meaning of Christmas in that old city of smoke and frost, not grandeur or feasts or glittering trees, but a single spark of mercy shared between two souls who might never meet again, yet carried each other's kindness forever. As evening settled over London once more, the fog rose from the river, soft and pearly, wrapping the city in its familiar shroud. But somewhere beneath the noise and soot and sorrow, there was still light, fragile, flickering, but unbroken. By April, the air above London had grown softer. Though the streets still carried the scent of soot and river mud, the city was waking from its long grey sleep. The fog no longer pressed so heavily against the gas lamps, and in the narrow yards behind the workhouse, the first green shoots broke through the thawed ground like timid promises. Martha felt older somehow, though only a few months had passed since Christmas. She'd begun helping in the laundry, folding sheets stiff from the cold air, her hands cracked but steady. Betsy, now healthier and bold enough to laugh again, followed her everywhere. Every Sunday after chapel, the girls sat together near the high window where light fell like pale gold onto the floor. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply watched the sky. "Do you think we'll ever get out of here?" Betsy asked one afternoon, her voice small. "Yes," Martha said quietly. "Not today, but someday." "How do you know?" "Because I've decided," Martha said, and smiled. "And when you decide something properly, it already begins to happen." She didn't explain what she meant, but she had begun to understand it herself. The world could be cruel, but not permanent. Even stone walls changed under the wind, and frost eventually melted. That spring, new parcels began to arrive at the workhouse. One brought more books. Another held a small box of pencils, slates, and copy paper. The label bore a familiar handwriting, graceful, careful, the same initials, E.B. The school mistress read the note aloud. "For the children's studies and sketches, may imagination make your walls larger than they seem." The words struck Martha like a secret message. That night, when the dormitory fell silent, she lay awake under her thin blanket, the faint moonlight spilling across the beds. In her mind, she drew pictures she could never put on paper. Trees of orange and gold, cities made of glass, rivers lined with flowers, and across London, in her quiet bedroom overlooking Berkeley Square, Eleanor sat at her desk, doing almost the same thing. She was sketching a scene she couldn't forget. A workhouse dormitory lit by morning, rows of narrow beds, and a girl with dark hair sitting upright, holding an orange in both hands as if it were a treasure. Eleanor Seck's governess came to check on her. "Still drawing, miss?" "Yes," Eleanor said softly, not looking up. "I want to remember her exactly." "Why?" "Because she looked brave." Eleanor said simply. Outside her window, spring rain began to fall, a slow, steady rhythm on the panes. She smiled faintly. "And because I think she changed me." For a moment, the two worlds felt less far apart. The same rain fell on slate roofs and marble ones alike, pattering against the city's endless patchwork of lives. The river swelled, carrying the reflection of lights from the bridges, lamps glowing like floating stars. In the following weeks, small acts of grace began to ripple through St. Bart. The matron allowed extra candles for evening lessons. The kitchen staff saved scraps for a stew that tasted faintly of meat. The boys' workroom received warmer blankets, and the girls' dormitory a proper rug down the central aisle. No one spoke of charity or miracles, but something unseen had softened the air. And every evening when the sky turned amber before fading to iron grey, the chapel bell tolled the hour. Its echo rolled out across the city, past the rooftops, the crowded markets, the polished glass of the Blackwood windows, and into the deep blue distance where chimney smoke met cloud. Eleanor sometimes paused by her window when she heard it, unaware that Martha, miles away, lifted her head at the same moment. Neither girl could see the other, but the sound bound them, a note of pure, steady gold ringing between two very different worlds. Years later, when both were grown, that sound would still haunt their memories, the tolling of the chapel bell on cold evenings, the faint scent of citrus in the dark, and the quiet certainty that kindness once kindled never truly goes out. For even in a city built on stone and sorrow, mercy moved like spring water, slow, unseen, but unstoppable. And so London in that long-ago year shed its frost and turned again toward light. The streets filled once more with noise and smoke, but somewhere beneath it all, two girls carried within them a gentleness that no hardship could ever unteach. And in the quiet before sleep, when dreams began their soft work, each could still taste it. The sweetness of one orange, the miracle of one shared Christmas, and the faint, endless echo of hope. By May, the Thames had thawed completely, carrying with it the driftwood and soot of a long winter. The markets returned to life, flowers spilling over the carts of Covent Garden in bursts of colour, violet, saffron, and white. The city smelled of wet stone and lilac again, and though poverty hadn't vanished, London felt momentarily gentler, as if the very air remembered kindness. In the workhouse, the spring sunlight fell differently. Less harsh, more forgiving, dust motes danced through the narrow windows of the girls' hall as Martha folded clean linen, the rhythm of her work almost musical. Her hands were rough but steady, her movements sure. She had learned to make peace with the hours. Each stitch, each scrub, each fold, a small rebellion against despair. When the bell rang for the afternoon meal, she caught a glimpse of Betsy skipping ahead, her laughter echoing down the corridor. The little girl's shoes were still too big, her dress too short, but her eyes shone bright as summer glass. That laugh, Martha thought, was worth every blister she'd earned. Outside, the city was full of contrasts again. Carriages rattled along cobbled streets, and gentlemen tipped their hats to ladies with parasols. The flower sellers called out in song, sweet violets, roses, fresh roses, their voices weaving through the hum of the crowd. And somewhere beyond the noise, church bells tolled softly across the rooftops, marking the hour when the afternoon sun hung golden and still. In a tall townhouse overlooking Berkeley Square, Eleanor Blackwood leaned against her window, watching those same bells shimmer in the distance. Her sketchbook lay open before her, filled with drawings of streets, chimneys, and faces. The workhouse girl appeared again and again, sometimes standing by a frosted window, sometimes smiling faintly beside a small child. She didn't show these sketches to anyone. They were her secret. The way other girls kept diaries or pressed flowers, but she had begun to write small notes on the pages, thoughts that felt too important to vanish. Kindness costs nothing, yet it changes everything. Poverty is in silence. It sets just unheard. Her mother often reminded her that she was growing up now, that her life would soon be filled with social calls and the duties of a lady. But Eleanor found herself longing for something larger than tea parties and embroidery. She wanted to truly see, the people hidden behind the walls of her city. By summer, her father's coach was making its weekly deliveries to the workhouse: books, paper, pencils, even a small box of paints. Each package bore the same initials, EB, written in Eleanor's careful script. No one at the workhouse knew the sender's age or face, but the gifts became something almost mythic, whispered about by the children as the letters from the lady who remembered us. Martha didn't believe in fairy tales anymore, but sometimes when she opened a new parcel and smelled the faint perfume clinging to the brown paper, she wondered if miracles might not be real after all. just quiet, ordinary things that slipped into your life unnoticed. She began using the pencils from the parcel to draw on scraps of wrapping paper, sketches of the laundry, the dormitory, and once a rough outline of the girl in the green velvet dress. Her drawings were clumsy, but they carried something alive, a feeling she couldn't put into words. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of pink and orange over the roofs of the workhouse, Martha hid her latest sketch under her pillow. Two girls facing each other through a wall of snow, each holding an orange. She fell asleep with a faint smile, dreaming of light. And across the city, Eleanor, now sitting by lamplight, was painting the same thing without knowing why. A girl's face framed by frost, her eyes full of quiet defiance. The two scenes, divided by class and distance, seemed to exist in perfect symmetry, joined by something unseen but deeply felt. When the summer night finally settled over London, the city glowed like a great lantern, windows lit, cobblestones gleaming faintly in the rain. And though the world would soon turn again to its harsh routines, factories roaring, debts rising, streets filling with the poor, the echo of that one winter still lingered. For somewhere deep beneath the noise, two hearts still carried its warmth. The scent of oranges in a cold room, the sound of a chapel bell through snow, and the unspoken truth that one small kindness, once given, can ripple endlessly through time. And so, even as the world changed its seasons, Christmas never really ended. It lived quietly in the corners of the city, in books passed between hands, in laughter shared over bread, and in the secret knowledge that light, once kindled, never truly dies. By late summer, London was golden and heavy with dust. The city breathed differently now, the river sluggish, the air thick with the mingled scents of horses, bread, and warm stone. Yet beneath the noise and bustle something quiet endured, a thread of gentleness that had taken root that passed Christmas and refused to die. In the workhouse yard, Martha hung linen to dry beneath a pale, endless sky. The sun caught on the white sheets, turning them almost beautiful for a moment, before the wind snapped them back into dull practicality. She stood barefoot on the cobbles, her feet calloused but free, her mind far away. "Betsy, hold the peg," she called, and the smaller girl scampered up, her hair escaping its braid. "You missed a corner. I like it better crooked," Betsy said with a grin. Martha laughed softly. "You sit'll make a dreadful servant one day if you keep that attitude." "Then I won't be a servant," Betsy said, eyes bright with impossible hope. It was a foolish thing to say, and yet Martha couldn't bring herself to scold her. There was something sacred in a child's refusal to believe the world would always be cruel. Inside, in the dim schoolroom, a new book had arrived that morning, donated as always by E.B. The schoolmistress had read aloud from it. A story about a girl who travelled through strange lands and faced great trials but never lost her courage. The younger children had listened with wide eyes, and even the older ones, those whose hearts had begun to harden, leaned closer. After the lesson, when the others left, Martha lingered by the desk. "May I borrow it, ma'am?" she asked. The schoolmistress hesitated, then nodded. "You sturt careful. Return it when you sturt done." That night, Martha read by the faint flicker of a candle stub, Betsy asleep beside her. The book's words seemed to glow brighter than the light itself. Stories of courage and kindness, of people who found warmth even in the darkest winters. She didn't know that somewhere across London, in a grander room filled with lamplight and velvet drapes, Eleanor had found a second copy in her father's library, left untouched since last Christmas. She read it slowly, thoughtfully, pausing over certain lines that echoed her own restless thoughts. The brave do not always fight. Sometimes they simply endure. When she reached the final chapter, she looked out her window toward the distant sprawl of the city. The fog was rising again, soft and silver, but she didn't see smoke or soot anymore. She saw stories, thousands of them, each belonging to someone like Martha. Her father Sit's voice called from the parlour below. "Eleanor, guests have arrived." "Coming, father," she answered, but she lingered for a moment longer, her fingers tracing the page. She had begun to write letters, small notes addressed not to any person but to ideas. What if kindness were policy? What if the poor were seen, not pitied? What if charity began with friendship? She didn't know yet that those letters, once shown to her father, would help shape the next year's reforms at St. Bart's. And while the city carried on, chimneys smoking, bells tolling, the river glinting beneath bridges slick with rain, change began, slow as the turning of the tide. At Christmas that year the oranges came again, but so did something new. There were blankets this time, extra candles and a promise. The older children would receive apprenticeships, not punishments. Martha didn't understand the politics behind it, nor did Eleanor, not fully. But when the two met again, one visiting, one standing quietly among the rows of grey uniforms, they both knew without speaking that the world had tilted just a little toward mercy.
"Do you still have your orange?"
Eleanor asked softly. Martha smiled faintly. I dried the peel. It still smells like sunshine. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. Then it did its job. Outside, snow began to fall. Fine, glittering flakes that caught in their hair, their eyelashes, their silence. For a moment, there was no workhouse, no class, no difference at all, just two girls side by side beneath the same white sky. And though the world around them would move on, forgetting, that small moment of grace remained, like a candle in a city of fog, still burning, still waiting to be seen. By the time autumn returned to London, the city wore its familiar melancholy again. Chimneys breathing grey ribbons of smoke, the Thames rippling under low clouds, and the scent of coal dust clinging to every street corner. Yet inside the walls of St. Bart's workhouse, something had quietly changed. The girls now rose before dawn as always, but their mornings felt different. The chapel's chill remained. The porridge was still thin, yet hope had found small corners to rest in, like sunlight slipping through a crack in the shutters. There were new books on the shelf, pencils that hadn't yet been worn to stubs, and every Sunday the schoolmistress read aloud a letter signed only E.B. Each letter was short, written in a gentle hand. The children listened to them as if they were prayers. To my friends at St. Bart's Sets, when I think of courage, I think of you. When I think of light in dark places, I think of your songs. I hope these small things remind you that you are seen. The children would whisper afterward, wondering who E.B. truly was. Some said it was the Queen herself. Others imagined a kind lady from the countryside. Only Martha suspected the truth, that it was the girl in the green velvet dress, the one who had smiled across the cold room and slipped her a secret orange. She carried that memory like a talisman through the months that followed, and every night before the lamps were dimmed, she still rubbed the dried peel between her fingers, releasing its fading scent into the air, a whisper of sweetness in a place that so rarely knew it. Across the city, Eleanor was growing older, her lessons shifting from sketching to etiquette, from arithmetic to the quiet art of being seen and saying little. But her thoughts returned often to that grey hall and the children within it. One afternoon, while her father dictated letters to his clerk, she approached him with something folded in her hand. "Father," she said, her voice steady though her heart raced. Could the bank do more than send money? He looked up from his papers. More? In what way? Could we teach them something? Eleanor asked. Not just give, but help them learn. Trades, reading, drawing, something that stays. Cornelius Blackwood watched his daughter for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You sound like your mother when she sits planning a charity ball." Eleanor blushed but didn't look away. "Not a ball, father. A chance." He leaned back in his chair, the old leather creaking softly. "You may write a proposal then. If it's sound, we shall see what can be done." That night, Eleanor stayed up late by candlelight, writing with fierce concentration. She didn't yet know how to change the world, but she was beginning to understand that you could start by changing one building, one rule, one mind at a time. By the next Christmas, her proposal had become a small pilot program. New apprenticeships, better lessons, an allowance for art supplies and reading books. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was movement, and movement was life. When she visited that winter, the workhouse hall looked just as cold, but the faces were brighter. She found Martha in the sewing room, older now, taller, her hands sure and calm over the cloth. "You draw?" Eleanor said softly, noticing the faint pencil sketches pinned to the wall. Flowers, rooftops, faces half finished but alive with feeling. Martha looked up, startled, then smiled. "Sometimes, when we sit done with our work, they are beautiful," Eleanor whispered. Martha hesitated. "We didn't know if we were allowed to keep them." "Then I say you are," Eleanor replied, and for a heartbeat they both laughed, a sound that felt scandalous in such a solemn room. Outside, the snow was beginning again, falling like ash over rooftops and carriages. Somewhere beyond the grey skyline, bells were ringing, the same bells that had once echoed through that Christmas long ago. As the two girls stood together, the world still divided by class and circumstance, they shared something larger than either could name, the quiet certainty that compassion, once awakened, doesn't vanish. It grows quietly, season by season, changing everything it touches. And long after the candles were snuffed, after the hall fell silent and London slept beneath its veil of snow, that kindness remained, bright as an orange, fragile as hope, eternal as winter light. By the next year, London had stepped fully into the 1860s, though much of it still smelled of smoke and horse dung, and the poor still queued for bread beneath the same cracked walls. Yet in small corners of the city, corners unnoticed by the men who ran it, there were changes too quiet for newspapers but too real to fade. At St. Bart's workhouse, the apprentices' program had begun. A few older boys had been sent to learn carpentry and shoemaking. 2 of the older girls had been placed in dressmakers' shops instead of laundry rooms, and every Wednesday the children had an hour of drawing instruction, a luxury made possible by one persistent letter from a certain Miss Eleanor Blackwood. Martha had become the best at it. Her sketches of daily life, sleeping children, thin bowls of soup, frost on the windows, had begun to decorate the walls of the schoolroom. She'd learned to mix soot and water to shade the edges of her pictures, turning scraps of paper into small pieces of defiance. Even Mrs. Grimwig, once quick to scold, had begun to pause at her desk longer than usual before muttering, "Not bad for a workhouse girl." It was that phrase, "for a workhouse girl," that Martha thought about most often. The way it reduced, confined, explained away every glimpse of brilliance the poor might show. She had begun to imagine another way of being, not rich, not even comfortable, but seen. On Christmas Eve, the chapel filled once again with candles and holly. The younger children sang the same carols they always had, their voices trembling but sincere. And when the orange crate was opened that year, there were not just oranges but also envelopes, small pale ones, sealed with a wax. Inside each was a small folded card bearing the same line written by Eleanor Sepp's hand: "This is not charity. It is remembrance. You are not forgotten." Martha held the note in her lap, like something sacred. She didn't look at anyone, not even Betsy, who was clutching hers with both hands. She just stared at the words until the ink blurred, not from tears but from the strange, fierce warmth they brought. Across town that same night in the Blackwood home, Eleanor stood before the Christmas tree, no longer a little girl but not yet grown. The lights flickered over her green dress, now replaced by a simpler one of soft grey wool. Her mother had long since abandoned the idea of turning her into a perfect society lady. There were whispers in the drawing rooms about that peculiar Miss Blackwood who spends her evenings writing letters to orphans. But Eleanor didn't care. "Father," she said quietly, as he poured himself a glass of port, "do you ever think of them, the workhouse children?" "Yes." Cornelius sighed, not unkindly. "You have a tender heart, Eleanor, but there will always be poverty in London. You mustn't let it consume you." "It doesn't consume me," she said softly. "It reminds me that we could be better." Her father didn't answer, but his eyes lingered on her longer than usual. Perhaps some part of him knew she was right. That night, when the house grew silent and the fire burned low, Eleanor slipped out into the corridor with a single orange in her hand. She peeled it slowly, as Martha once had, saving each segment as if it were treasure. The scent filled the cold hallway, bright, golden, alive. She thought of the workhouse dormitory, of small hands unwrapping their oranges, of laughter breaking rules, of a city divided yet connected by the simplest sweetness. And as snow began to fall over London once more, she whispered a small prayer, not to change the whole world, only to keep that small warmth alive. For one day she believed those tiny sparks, letters, drawings, oranges, names, might join into something larger. Not charity, not duty, but recognition. Somewhere beyond Berkeley Square, in the quiet dormitory of St. Bart's, Martha stirred in her sleep. The orange rested beneath her pillow, as it had every year, the scent of it faint but still there. And in both rooms, separated by miles but united by memory, two young women dreamed the same dream, of a London where warmth did not have to be rare, and where kindness, simple, stubborn, human, could last longer than winter itself. Winter returned again, and London, eternal in its contrasts, wore its cold like a second skin. Gas lamps glowed through the fog. The river steamed faintly under bridges heavy with frost, and bells rang out from spires that disappeared into the grey sky. The city changed its fashions and its kings, but its streets still told the same story, one of hunger and hope interwoven like the threads in an old beloved quilt. By now, Martha Watts was no longer a child. She had grown into a young woman with steady hands and calm eyes, apprenticed to a seamstress who sold her work in a small shop off Fleet Street. Each stitch she made carried the patience the workhouse had taught her, the art of turning pain into precision, silence into strength. Sometimes when she worked by the window, she'd see children pass by in rags, just as she once had, and she would smile faintly, remembering a time when kindness had arrived in the shape of a single orange and a girl in a green velvet dress. That same girl, Eleanor Blackwood, was now a woman herself. Her letters had become more than simple notes. She had begun to speak in halls and churches, to write to newspapers, to stand beside the reformers of her age. Her family's wealth, once just comfort, had become her weapon against indifference. She was no saint, no saviour, just a woman who had once looked into another girl's eyes and understood that mercy meant seeing. Years later, their paths crossed once more, not in the cold stone hall of St. Bart, but in a small charity workshop near Holborn, where women learned to sew for a living wage. Eleanor entered quietly, her gloved hand brushing the door frame, and there, bent over a table of cloth and thread, stood Martha. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The world outside went on with its carriages and factory whistles, its laughter and its dust. But inside that narrow room, time itself seemed to pause. "Martha," Eleanor said softly. The seamstress straightened, recognition dawning slow but certain. The years had changed their faces, but not their eyes. "You kept your promise," Martha said simply. Eleanor smiled. "And you kept your courage." They stood together in silence. Two women shaped by the same winter, the same memory. No grand words were needed. The moment itself was enough. A quiet meeting of gratitude and grace, of the giver who learned to listen, and the receiver who learned to rise. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft, unhurried, drifting between the narrow alleys of London. A carriage rattled past, a bell tolled somewhere far off, and in the stillness that followed, it seemed the whole city exhaled. That night, as Martha locked the shop and began her walk home, she passed a fruit stall on the corner. Piled high under the flickering gaslight were oranges, bright, glowing, fragrant. She paused, bought one, and carried it carefully through the mist. At home she set it on the table, lit her candle, and peeled it slowly. The scent filled the room, the same sweet, impossible perfume she remembered from childhood. She smiled and whispered, "Merry Christmas," though the calendar said February. Across the city, Eleanor, too, sat at her desk beneath the soft hiss of a coal fire. On her table lay a letter half-written, and beside it an orange. She hadn't eaten it yet. She was saving it, as she always did, for remembrance. Two lives, once divided by walls and wealth, now moved in quiet harmony, proof that even the smallest kindness, offered once and forgotten by the world, can ripple outward forever. And so London slept beneath its endless fog, its rivers whispering the same ancient lullaby, but in two warm rooms, one humble, one grand, the same light glowed against the dark, the colour of fire, of courage, of oranges, the colour of hope.